This is Remote Ruby.
Have you any remote idea to the meaning of the word?
Hello, boys.
Yo.
What's up?
What's up? Oh, God. What if we did an episode just 60 minutes of us yelling, what's up? And everyone born after...
It sounds very familiar.
I mean, everyone born before 1994. So I guess before 1990... You're 96. Yeah, so 94 might be a good still. That might hold true.
Yeah. Yeah, when did that whole thing come out? That was...
I'll Google it.
A long time ago.
99 to 2002.
I'm still pooping myself, probably. Not that I don't still, but...
Oh, sweet God almighty. Really putting Paul through the ringer this week as I record with a set of AirPods right now.
That's actually a pro move.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's just like DHH, that episode. This is the professional setup here.
He's the OG Rails developer right here.
They are AirPod Pros. So, I mean, it is...
Well, it's in the name.
A literal pro move.
Pro Max.
Ultrafine 4K.
Yeah.
8K, baby.
Atmos.
Surround sound, spatial sound, lossless sound.
Confirmed.
I was doing this really cool thing after surgery where I was like, oh, I'm doing really well. So I'll sit at my desk for 8 hours and then my legs started swelling. So I got moved back to the couch.
Your new prison.
The new Chili's. Or no, the Chili's is a new golf course. That's what it is. It's an office quote for you.
We're getting a brand new Chili's here in town. We're excited for it.
Are you? Don't.
I'm amped.
You should lower your expectations for Chili's. If you haven't had it in a while.
We did. We went to another location. It was awful. But
love it.
This is going to be brand new. So, maybe it'll be better.
Still the same food coming off the same Cisco truck.
From the same microwaves.
The other day, I was on Uber and there was a Maggiano's, if that's how you pronounce it. And we don't have those in Memphis. And I was like, wait a second. And so I looked up the address and it was the Chili's address. So they run an Italian kitchen and it's just wings restaurant, like these like ghost kitchens out of Chili's on Uber Eats. And I was like, yeah.
That really pisses me off because they labeled Hooters food as Hootie's seafood or something, like Hootie's Hootie's Southern Broil or something. And I was like, sweet, a new local restaurant with Southern seafood. That sounds great. And this is when I was living at the ocean. And when I saw a Hooters bag outside my door, bro, I went nuclear. That was unacceptable to me. Unacceptable. It was gross. I ate it. I ate half of it maybe. It was just as disgusting as everything else from Hooters. Ugh. I was so pissed.
Oh, Charlie's has a ghost kitchen. I think it's seafood here in Memphis. And I don't know if you know this, but other than the Mississippi River, we don't have real fish options here. So, yeah.
Gross.
I think that's it for this week.
Yep.
Nope. The food reviews, remote Uber Eats.
There's this article this woman wrote. It was like a review of a chain restaurant. Has anyone heard of this?
I've seen a lot of...
I need more context.
There's this older woman who lived in a small town and a chain restaurant like a Chili's or no Charlie's came in. And she wrote this review of it like it was a hometown restaurant. And it was like one of those this is really sweet and really funny moments. I saw it years ago.
You did remind me of an article that was Applebee's had all you can eat appetizers or whatever. So they came in at the opening hour and then they sat there until evening when they closed and just ate appetizers nonstop. Yeah, that sounds like a fun thing to do.
It was Olive Garden. It was an 85-year-old grandma. Put it in the show notes.
Applebee's also is a trap for ADHD people. I've never been back. They have these electronic things on the table where you can pay your bill, which is cool. I like that. But it also has games on it. I'm like, yo, what kind of games this thing got? So I'm picking it up and I'm playing with it. And then at the end of the meal, they added a charge for that. And I was so upset.
Yeah, I've seen those. It's convenient. I like paying on it because you just swipe your card when you're done. But then there's this like awkward, I promise I paid when I walked out moment.
And I know what you're talking about.
It's just like, I won't leave cash on a table when I leave, like for my bill, because I don't trust.
Yeah, you just leave Dogecoin.
Well, duh. Doge.
I have to say, like, I almost never eat at any of those restaurants. And basically, if I go somewhere and there are those machines on the table, then I'm like, this is going to be awful. It is such an American thing. It's like, oh, God forbid we have to talk to a person. We can like order water, like a refill on here. We can add food on the little device and whatever. And it's like, no. And no restaurants that use these are any good.
I think that's the thing. I actually like the not talking to people.
Yeah, I do too.
But it's at restaurants where talking to people might not end up in the result that I want still.
It's definitely weird. And it's one of those things where it's like, I've been to like meetups and stuff where people are like, oh, I'm building an app for restaurants and you're going to be able to do all this stuff on the tablets and whatever. And I'm like, oh God, not again.
I want Cafe 80s from Back to the Future 2, where the tube TV comes over and they talk to it and they're like, I want a Pepsi. And the Pepsi pops out from a little hole in the counter. That's all I want. I don't care about tablets.
There was that fully automated McDonald's or whatever that I saw recently. And heck, the people at McDonald's, like, you go through the drive-thru and you watch the soda machine, just like it picks out a cup, it fills the drink up with ice and everything. And then they just pick it up and hand it to you. And it's like, well, how much more automation do we need? Like, not a lot. We just need to get into robotics software. If Rails ever goes out of style, we're going to build,
Ruby
robotics.
On bots.
Yeah.
Bots on Ruby.
Robotics on Ruby, on Rails, on
Rust.
Done.
Ship it. It sounds like you need an outlet, Chris, to gripe. Speaking of outlets, have y'all looked at the new Stimulus Outlets API?
The day it was announced, but I've not looked at it at all since. Is that on the regular website?
Yes. So what it does is it allows you to reference other stimulus controller instances and their controller element from inside a different stimulus controller. And they can be anywhere on the page. So like a lot of times you run in this issue where you're trying to access something and it's not like the controller is not defined on the right element up the DOM tree. And then you're like, now what do I do? And what we usually do at Podia, which I think a lot of people are also doing, is like we're heavily relying on custom events to be like, okay, well, we'll dispatch a custom event from the stimulus controller and it will go then do these things on wherever we've defined the controllers that are listening to it.
Yep.
Let's not forget about get controller by ID and element, which is a method that exists in stimulus that
I've never
used. So painful to use. Exactly.
I've never used that.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
That's what led us to custom events. Sorry, continue.
Well, I mean, even in the outlets thing, it says the use of outlets helps with cross-controller communication and coordination of it's an alternative to dispatching custom events on controller elements. So it sounds like Basecamp that must have been how they were kind of solving it before. So
yeah, that was the advice on the forums and everything from the very beginning. Like, cause that was almost immediately a common question that was coming up that was like, okay, I have a to-do list controller and to-dos controllers. And how do I like check all or whatever and talk to these other instances and stuff? So yeah, I remember the get element, get controller by whatever that name was. And then it was like, oh, okay. The custom events is very stimulus-like. It's very intuitive for everything else you're doing is an event on something. So it made a lot of sense to that, but you still had to do like the query and find those elements and then fire the event off. So yeah, it's nice to have that reference now between them, just kind of directly linked, and you treat it like targets basically. So that's super handy.
That's been the problem with custom events though, is that they can only bubble up. And so they work great if something happens in the target that you want to tell the parent controller about. because you can bubble that child up. But if you need to go down, then you can still, like you said, like query targets and fire events. It still feels broken even using custom events that way.
Yeah. There's no bubble down.
You kind of have to just dispatch it on the window, right?
What would be, it's bubbles. So what would be the opposite? Deflating? Deflates?
Popping bubbles. One thing that does come to mind too on this though is like, you'd have to fire the event, but also like remember to write the data action stuff to listen to it. It ends up being, I don't want to say spaghetti exactly, but like the place where you need that stuff to actually sort of be like linked is gone, and you can easily make mistakes with that stuff. And I feel like one of the things that makes the code a lot harder to reason about is like, hey, this function just gets called randomly and I don't know how or where. Whereas if you can use the outlets, like here's all the things, run these operations on them. And when you need to debug something, it's very intuitive. It's not like this event came out of nowhere and then triggered this thing to happen. It's so much more linear and easy to follow when you have the outlets API like this, I think.
It is spaghetti. Like you said, you don't want to call it that. I will. It is.
But I love spaghetti.
That's actually one of my least favorite foods. But
Spaghetti.
What about cucumbers?
oh god,
Love that.
I've had a lot of conversations about that recently.
Everybody needs to bring Jason cucumbers at RailsConf.
Thank God. I recently learned that apparently there's like some people born with or without like this enzyme that makes them actually hate it. And I wonder if I have that. But anyway,
Is it in your 23andMe?
you know what? I will do one to find out.
Well, I've got the like cilantro tastes like soap thing.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
it's probably a similar deal. Yeah.
Wait, cilantro literally tastes like soap to you?
Not always, but it definitely does a lot of the time. If I go to Chipotle and get cilantro rice, sometimes I just feel like I'm eating soap. And other times it's like totally fine. So I don't know if it's like what exactly about it is, but cilantro is the main trigger there. I love soap though. I'll just eat it. Snack on a bar of soap or cilantro. You'll never know.
I'm dying to hold on to where we were in the conversation. I'm really proud, but I'm struggling. I'm like, I feel it internally. I'm shaking like I'm going to lose it. I get what you're saying, and I agree about it's kind of like procedural in a way. Like all your logic right there, like these are the elements, these things need to happen on them or with them. Where the events, like it feels like spaghetti. And like in a perfect world, these things that aren't coupled, they're decoupled, are nice. But eventually, what I've learned, even like this week, has been reminded of is these isolated things that are decoupled. Eventually, you need them to kind of run in a certain order. We've been battling like race conditions with like events firing and things like that this week, custom events, and had to really like back out of a very like custom event heavy approach.
It just has the concurrency problems. It just makes things that much harder. And then you might have an event and you have a method that it calls. That's nice and descriptive and everything. But with outlets, you can actually call methods inside of the other controller as well. So it's like really nice to be able to jump from their example here is search controller with a results controller. And you can go through the results and then call mark is selected, which is the function in their other controller. So it's like you actually get to talk to this other object and do what you want. The event situation would be basically, hey, whatever event gets fired and we happen to know that this mark is selected function gets called. But this is explicit and you can see exactly in the parent controller what exactly happens in the children, which is nice. And hopefully when you have an error, your stack trace in the browser is going to actually show you all of that stuff rather than just this crashed, there was some event. You're going to have to put in a debugger and figure out that event and maybe where it was created from, but it just becomes much harder to track down. But like you said, that effectively removes that whole async situation that's going on when you're trying to debug like those weird ordering errors and other things like that with events that are running concurrently like that.
Yeah, we had a case where we built this drop down using a button. It's like the button actually triggers the drop down. And so we built a stimulus controller that like, okay, when I select this thing in the drop down, update the button's value, and it sends a custom event to another element on the page, because when you select something from this drop down, it has a side effect. And we were running into this problem where like we were sending two of the same event over and they ended up in a race with each other. So the data was actually bad because the second one landed before the first one, and then the first one didn't have all the correct data. Like it was a mess. And so
Yeah.
we had to
That's
back
like
out of that.
your standard webhook arriving out of order stuff. That's just a giant pain to deal with. At least with webhooks, you can say, okay, this happened. Give me the latest data. But in a JavaScript event, it's like, how are you going to pull the latest data? We're not using React or whatever with all the state there.
Speaking of webhooks, I'm going to shift gears a little bit.
Man, race conditions and shifting gears. And I mean, you're on a roll.
Oh, nice. I saw Wes Bos tweet this morning. He had a Paw Patrol cup and he said, rough recursion. And it like ruined my morning because I was like, all of a sudden these two worlds had collided where it's like Paw Patrol and programming. And I don't know. It bothered me.
I can see that. I'm already going insane here in the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse.
It's the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. Yep.
Just nonstop, and it will never leave my brain. So
Lennon just moved off of that onto she's doing Peppa Pig, which our oldest did. So it's okay. And she's also doing Blippi, which pretty young feels like for a Blippi, but she's into it.
I wouldn't mind if it was SpongeBob.
South Park.
Sure.
Yeah, we'll just start them on South Park.
Show them the world.
So on Jobboardly, I've only been doing connected webhooks because I haven't been doing any like of my own payments for people using Jobboardly. I was using Stripe Event and I started adding webhooks for my Stripe account, not just the connected ones. And then I was realizing I needed to listen to the same event, both. I needed to listen to checkout completed, both for mine and for job boards. And I couldn't figure out a good way to do it with Stripe Event. I ended up pulling out Stripe Event and just putting in like a Stripe webhooks controller and a Stripe Connect webhooks controller and just patching them to different endpoints. Have you ever encountered that with Stripe Event?
We used to depend in pay on Stripe Event, but I actually wrote my own. All the internals of it run on the active support notification thing. So you can like have multiple subscribers, which is nice because I can have my own processors. And then you as the user can say, hey, after that, I want to run my own thing to like fulfill an order or something. So the way that we do it is in pay, listen to the same events all at the same endpoint and the same processor. But we keep track of, I believe a Stripe account is sent over as a param, and we will effectively include that on the pay customer record. So you can have like your customers have a nil Stripe account, and then the merchants will have pay customers with the Stripe account set.
Oh, I see.
And when that's set, then every single API request that we make will automatically include that as the extra parameter on every Stripe charge or subscribe or whatever you're doing. So we kind of just assign that to the database record, and then we've got that just always there and always available, and you can't mess it up basically. So it just tries to treat it the same as much as possible for all that. So that's kind of how we have it set up.
Hi, my name is Andrew Mason, and I'd like to tell you about Honeybadger. Whether US East 1 is down or you forget to add a configuration file, everyone has an outage from time to time. When your next outage occurs, transparency is critical. The difference between a minor annoyance that people soon forget and a fiasco that creates sustained resentment is how you communicate. That's why you need Honeybadger. Honeybadger is a crucial component of your incident response plan with their uptime monitoring service that now has an exciting new feature, public status pages. Create a new status page with custom domains, branding, and more. Don't let Twitter be the only way your users can find out if your app's down. Sign up for Honeybadger to improve your incident response with a shiny new status page that you'll be proud to show users. Visit honeybadger.io and start giving your users a better experience today. Let them know that Remote Ruby and specifically Andrew Mason sent you.
I looked in Stripe events and I saw like you can give multiple signing secrets because you have a separate secret for each connect and regular. And then that's what I ended up doing. I couldn't figure out a way to tell subscribe this checkout connected event here if there's an account perimeter and here if there's not. So I ended up with an if conditional on the block. And then I was like, that is going to cause problems. Like it was looking for like if the Stripe account's present. And so I was like, you know what? I know how to write Rails controllers that respond to post requests.
Yeah.
And I just wrote like a case statement of like, if it's this event, call this class and that class has all the code. So
that's the easiest way to go about it. I think it's straightforward and simple and whatever. We've got now the like webhook comes in, we verify it with the signing secrets, and then we shove it into a database record for pay webhooks and then queue up a job just like Action Mailbox does. So if you get Black Friday, crazy amounts of webhooks, just shove them in the database as fast as possible. We'll get to them when we get to them. And then background jobs can chew through those and rehydrate them because Stripe's objects have like a construct from or something. So if you have just the Ruby hash of it, you can toss it into that and it will like hydrate the object again, which is cool. So it's nice to be able to like serialize and deserialize it like that. I just got thinking you could probably do that as a custom serialized method in Active Record, have like a load and dump method that would take Stripe object and dump it and load it. And that would be like a seamless way of doing that. That's actually kind of cool. Yeah. The only like annoying part about those in Active Record is they don't give you any context. So if gave you the Stripe object, it wouldn't be able to like also give you the database record, which I found really kind of annoying. They're intended to be like pure JSON parse and, dump. It just, okay, we don't need any context. But I felt like there was a few situations in the past trying to implement that. Knowing what record I'm operating on, I might want to change how things work. It is what it is. But anyways.
And I realized I didn't do a very good job for those who aren't familiar. So Stripe event isn't actually a Stripe package. It's a gem and
third-party gem for processing Stripe webhooks.
It works great, especially if you only have like one side of the transactions, one side of like the relationship. But I use Stripe Connect to allow people to connect their Stripe account. So I have to listen for webhooks on their behalf. So when somebody like purchases a job posting, Stripe sends me a webhook. I say, oh, this belongs to Chris's job board and attribute that and run the code to post the job and stuff like that. So,
and each of those events just receives either a callable object or a block for you to process. And then, you could in there say, if there's a Stripe account parameter, then run it through this other class or something and organize it that way. But a lot of times you're just kind of create a class or whatever and have it call the call method. And I guess you could split it out inside your class too or whatever. But it's just tricky to try and do that stuff sometimes.
I also had to write some redirect code. I had somebody migrating a job board. You get to redirect their existing paths from their old one. The way I solved that was as like a fallback path, a catch-all at the very end, which I was using for pages. I had to adjust a little bit. I added a routing constraint that if you get there, it'll first look to see at the subdomain or the domain to see what job board it belongs to. And then I actually create a redirects table in the database. So it'll actually say, like, does this redirect exist for this board? And if that returns true, it will do the redirect. Otherwise, it will just 404.
Nice. Yeah, that's kind of like, reminds me of like the friendly ID history feature, where like friendly ID will give you the slugs, the friendly IDs, but the history feature, which isn't very well documented, if you're on GitHub and you rename your repository, GitHub remembers that old one and redirects to the new one unless some other project creates one with the same name, it's effectively that same sort of feature where it's like, hey, we got a list of redirects and like, we'll query this table in case we don't find the record immediately. And then if we find a redirect, we can handle that, or 404 if it's not there. So it's kind of fun to have like the dynamic redirects like that in your application. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. It was fun to do it as a routing constraint because I could have just had like a catch-all controller.
Yep.
It actually checks two things. It first looks to see, is there a page that has the same path? And if so, like the page gets priority. So the reason it's in a constraint is it can return false, which will not match that route, and then go to the pages route, which is like get slug. So it was a fun little challenge. And then I just used a maintenance task to like import a CSV of redirects for them because they gave me a CSV. I don't know. It was a fun, it's something I haven't really done in a while. So it was fun to build.
That's great. I really like those things. And I don't feel like enough people use the routing constraints because a lot of times you're writing the constraint. Like if you do it as a class, you're writing it as, assuming you're inside the routes file or whatever. But what I found for like multi-tenant apps is that those classes should also just live in your application as a general helpful tool. So you can say like inside of your views or your controller or whatever, you could use that same thing and it can look at the request and say, oh, this is for a not www. So we'll assume that it's a customer's subdomain. And so you can use that on the routing level and change the routes that are available, but you can also use that in your views. If you want to reuse them for, your application and for the customer facing side of things, you can just reuse them anywhere you want. So before actions in controllers, it's really handy. And say like in your views, maybe you have like your edit profile. You could use that on the regular page, but also on a subdomain. And maybe you include a different snippet here or there, and you can use them anywhere. And I think that's almost never talked about. Like they're always just, here's a little class that returns true or false in your routes, but it's also very handy for other situations too. And I think it's virtually no code changes because it operates off the request. So it's like requests available in your controller and your views and your helpers. So like you're good to go and you can reuse that thing anywhere. And I believe you just pass the request in as a parameter. Is that right? So like you could set it in current attributes and use it in your models or whatever crazy thing if you wanted.
Yeah. So routing constraints is basically, it's just, as Chris was saying, it looks for one method on the class you tell it the constraint is. And that's matches ? It takes the request and then you got to return true or false. And if it returns true, it considers this constraint true and does everything inside of it, or otherwise it's false and doesn't. But one thing you mentioned current, one thing I started doing is, so I have a board constraint that will look up to see if they're matching custom domain or subdomain for the request. And I'll actually set current.board there because I've already got to do the board lookup.
It's one of those things that feels dirty to do a database query in your routes. But it's like the second that this actually would hit the controller, we'd have to look it up anyways. And well, it's always going to be more accurate because you would end up just doing that check in your controller or whatever and kicking you out or doing a 404 or something.
I'm going to look up the board here and I'm going to return true or false. And then in my application controller and some before filter, I'm going to look up the board again, the job board. So if I've already looked it up, I can just set it as current. And again, like I try to be really careful with current, but this one has felt right so far. The other thing I did was I set, if there is a board that matches, I set some active storage configuration based on the board as well. I set that there while I'm there. So
you just reminded me of something the other week that I was fixing, that it's like time.zone or something is automatically handled by active job or whatever. So it like active job has the current, if it's set in current and you create a job, it'll be like set in the job and you'll have like current.user or whatever automatically set for you. There's like something in one of my apps, like we set time zone on the request and it was like being set in the job as well. But the job I had written to calculate, maybe that's what it was, like the metered billing stuff on Hatchbox. Because the job was just like, hey, what's the current time? And it would end up switching time zones based upon what the users had set. And so the calculations were like different every time because it would be dependent on the user's time zone. It really needs to run on like the server time zone because it's like running every 4 hours in a cron job instead. And that was like somebody had, if I remember now, it was like Afghanistan or something as their time zone set. And then it was doing like, we're not working off of central time -6 UTC or whatever. It was like positive or whatever. So the like numbers were way off. And I was like, oh my God, this is hilarious. It's one of those things where it's a nicety that Rails does that for you. But then it's also like, I can't believe that I didn't even think of that because you don't even think about, hey, there's these other things now automatically being taken care of for you, which is very handy. Yet you need to know about that. Otherwise, you're going to run into some weird edge cases. It wasn't the metered billing. I can't remember exactly. It was something around that because it was some job that a user had queued up, which, yeah, I don't know, but fun times.
Yeah, that use of current has been all right for me. It hasn't bitten me yet because if a request matches that subdomain, I've got to have a current board set anyway. So like my integration, my controller tests, all that, I have to set a host no matter what. So I don't have to like in the controller do like current.set and give it a block to run the spec because it's already set based off the host.
Some of that just comes down to like the performance of it can be just optimized where it's like, look, we know that we've reserved www, help, support, whatever, admin, you name it, like you pick your ones. And then you have a routing constraint that's like, these are already reserved. So if it matches any of those, we like run the regular application. If it doesn't match those, then we'll assume that it's a customer's subdomain. And that's okay to go query the database because just like going to twitter.com or github.com/Jason Charnes, like that has to go through and see like you didn't register as Twitter at help where you might end up stealing their whole like /help route. You know, that they've got to order it properly so that all of their stuff takes importance over these others. And then it's like, look, you would have had to, no matter what, query the database to respond to this request. So like, it's not a problem to do the querying in the constraint there or whatever. So yeah, I'm with you on that. The only downside to current attributes is that my love of using web console to debug stuff, the request is over. And when you run the web console request, you're not logged in anymore. And it just sucks because it's like, I really want to use that. And I've cheated by assigning current.user, but adding a helper method for current user and caching it into an instance variable because that does actually persist. So the hacky solution there kind of works, but it is annoying because I love using web console when like I get a 500 error and I see the stack trace and I'm like, okay, let's go fix it and figure out what happened. And then you're like current.user, whatever. And it's like, can't call whatever on nil class. And you're like, God dang it. It sucks. But I don't think that's fixable either. Maybe there is a way to do it where it's like, it's assigned for the current request, but if an error is raised, don't do the automatic reset or whatever. But those also probably run in other threads too or whatever. So like, you know, the request is going to have it saved for that thread. But if your web console goes and makes a request in another thread, current user wouldn't be set. And so concurrency problems, bro.
I think we lost Andrew.
He's just thinking about concurrency problems.
I'm like stewing in stress right now.
Are you deadlocked?
Yes. My brain is seg-faulted.
What are you stressed about?
Many things. And I'm also just exhausted from this week.
From this conversation?
Yeah.
From us?
Extra brain activity at Friday afternoon is what pushed me over the edge.
Yeah.
I want to give a shout out to Carlos Antonio, who's working on fixing up. Finally, he's making some progress on Responders and Devise. So fingers crossed, we can keep that going and get a Hotwire compatible version of that soon. It's just been so needed and like just awful for beginners who read one of million tutorials that are like, let's install Devise, and you're using Rails 7 and all of a sudden nothing works properly. Not a good look for the Rails community. I'm going to do whatever I can to help them out and get that going. We got a little bit of that stuff done in Responders, but there's still like some things to do in Devise and just do it properly. A lot of the PRs for fixing that were like, just disable turbo. And it's like, you could, but that's not a proper solution. And I don't think that that is acceptable for a project like that. But it might be, you know, it's debatable. You could be like, well, at least we could add that stuff today and ship it. And you can then take your time and do it the proper way later. But it sucks either way. So I'm excited to see that finally get hopefully in a good place soon and out there. The other thing I was going to share was last night, I think one of the Jumpstart customers was talking about integrating with an API that doesn't have a Ruby gem. And I was like, I have a trick up my sleeve. And what ended up happening was I like prototyped his API integration and got it done in like 20 minutes last night with this class that I've already kind of been working on. So this morning I spent some time and wrote effectively an API base class in Jumpstart. I think we're going to call it application client. And then you have a generator now where you can run Rails generate API client DigitalOcean or Twitter or whatever. And we will drop in the application client, which will be like the typical authentication with like the authorization header and bearer and your token. And it ships with the basic net HTTP stuff. I didn't want any other dependencies, but we've got get, post, patch, put, and delete. You give it the paths and you give it the arguments for like the body, and you kind of get just a simple interface for it. But it's like, I can go now integrate with an API, only the endpoints I actually need, no dependencies, don't have to worry about, like recently I was using the DigitalOcean droplet kit gem. They didn't even have a feature that their API supported in their official gem. So I had to patch their gem, run a fork until they merged my PR and then switch back to it and stuff. And things get out of date and whatever. And you've got dependencies like that aren't compatible with the new Ruby or the new Rails or something. So I've just switched to kind of just building every integration myself because it gives me a good understanding of their API and like it's real easy to debug and make maintainable. So we're going to end up including that in Jumpstart here shortly. It's really very little code, 100 lines of code for this like API client class. And then you just inherit from it, change your base URI, and add your methods for the different API endpoints and make your requests and you're good to go. And then you can easily slap webmock on there and test it and everything. And it's just simple, or VCR if you want to like record the request and everything too and test against the real sandbox endpoints or something. So it's going to be, I think, a really handy little tool to have in the toolkit. I notice when sometimes, do you guys do this where like you write something for one project and then you're working on something else and you kind of did the same thing in this other thing? Let me go copy paste that. And I've done this enough times that I'm like, all right, let's make it like a repeatable thing that people can use. I've tried to organize it in a little easy to override, like the default headers with authorization in there. So if you needed to change that and do something else, it's easy to override those, but I bet you we could also just have little modules you include. And it's like include bearer token auth or something. And they do the override or whatever, modify the little client for whatever's kind of the typical different mechanisms for authentication or whatever it is. Like right now, another good example of that is like this assumes that the API is a JSON API. maybe you're doing XML and you could just change the default content type and like the response body parser from JSON.parse to whatever, XML, maybe no Kogiri, I guess, XML parser. It's kind of cool, like just a very simple thing, but try to make it modular and interchangeable, those little features and stuff, but no extra dependencies if possible, which has been handy.
Yeah. The older I get, the more weary I become of abstractions. And that sounds like a really cool abstraction. That sounds very useful. So that's cool.
Yeah, it's like almost not an abstraction because it's like, look, frankly, the net HTTP methods are super frustrating because they're shortcuts for get and post and nothing for the other things that we normally use on an API. So I basically made a make request function that will like merge in query parameters into the URL and the body and everything else. And that's just like annoying to do differently with net HTTP for like, you can do the short examples for 2 of them, but you have to go the long route for put, patch, and deletes. So if we could just make one method that the request type is interchangeable, then we just pass in the request type and then the rest of the processing is basically the same. We just assume you don't include a body when you make a GET request, for example. So they're like basically no abstraction. It's just here's a way to make requests and not have to include REST client or HTTP party or whatever. Like you just get that and define your methods on it and stuff. And I think the other thing that I find really frustrating is a lot of the Ruby API clients like to do sort of this nesting thing for mapping out the API resources. And I found that like quite strange. And I really like the way that Stripe does it, where it's kind of like just have classes for all these top level things and you just call methods on that. And like the Braintree ones are like, you got to call Braintree gateway .transaction .sale, and the transaction some intermediary class. It's not even a class, it's a method. And it's like, it would have been easier to just go straight to a class and understand I'm going to talk to this and receive a transaction object back. It's going to be hopefully pretty cool. I guess that'll be another thing to work on too, is maybe like adding class methods. The Stripe API I was just thinking about has like one token. So they have class methods for all of their retrieve and delete and their actions. But for us, if you're taking an access token, you can just create an instance of it and use instance methods. So it probably depends a little bit on the API. Like Stripe always use the one API key, but a lot of the other clients are like, you want them to be interchangeable. So like if you're integrating with GitHub, you want not to have to force your API token. You want to be able to interchange it with other people's. So it's kind of nice to have all those different options though.
I'm a big fan of creating class methods to just forward to. I do that a lot where I'll have like a Heroku class and it defines, I don't know, something on it. And then creating self.foo that calls new with whatever's passed in and then call foo.
Yeah, because you could do like, you could imagine Heroku.deploy app and you give it the app and it's like, we call new and we figure out what to pass in here and how to assign the access token or whatever from the app. And then, you know, it's just a shortcut, makes it real easy to instantiate the object, do the setup stuff, and actually execute the action at the end of it. Yeah, I love those. The shortcuts are really nice to work with like that.
Yeah.
So, and then you don't have to
code clean.
It does. And you don't have to remember the other code that's calling Heroku.deploy doesn't care about how to authenticate with Heroku. So you can nicely hide that away. And all of the actual interactions are like contained then inside of the Heroku method there, the class method that it's like, okay, well, you told me what to do and I know how to figure out how to pull that off and find the keys and whatever. Yeah, that's a really good pro tip. I don't think that's used often enough either in a lot of code that I see. Usually it's like everything's instance methods and we have to call the ones that I find annoying are like Heroku.new with no arguments, and then you call deploy and pass in the app. It's like, why did I have to call new if you already knew that? Yeah, it's just like,
That's my smell test. If I have to do that, like, because I'm not interested in calling new if I'm not passing it anything. So
Right.
that's like my first
Right.
smell test where like, I'm going to make a class method because I'm just going to call that.
yeah, that's a good one to look for. I think that's good advice to go look for any .new calls that don't pass in any arguments. It's like, well, why wouldn't you just get rid of that so the person using this API doesn't even have to know about it? That would be much better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it. I use it a lot. I don't know where I picked up that pattern from, but I do it all the time.
I remember seeing it on many blog posts and things over the years, and it has stuck because it starts to grind your gears when you see that. You're like, oh, why am I doing this? Why do I have to call new just to like straight call another method? The only other thing I was thinking of, like 2 weeks ago or whatever, I was working on a little gem called ReviseAuth that was just a quick experiment of like, oh, I'm going to go build something like Devise that's just using has secure password and everything that's out of the box with Rails. And there's actually some more cool things coming out in Rails 7.1 that will improve custom authentication like that. Like the authenticate by method now has the ability to pass in the current password and verify that as well. So if you're doing like an update password form, you can pass in your current password and whatever and use that like you would normally see in authentication steps, but it's now nice and smooth. And there's a few other things that I think it's all mostly Jonathan Hefner working on those things, which is amazing. It's just been cool to see some of that. We were like talking about backporting some of those so that they're available in the gem for Rails 7 and just include those as needed if you're on a older Rails version. And it's probably going to be intentionally simpler than the million things that Devise supports, but it was just a goal of having like, oh, here's a quick, easy authentication system, very similar to Devise. You can override the controllers if you want to customize them and the views and whatever, but we can ship updates, security fixes and things that you just gem update and voila, you're fixed. So that's kind of one of the upsides of like, if you use a generator, security fix comes out, you got to rerun the generator. It's going to override files or you got to diff between them and stuff. And it's just like a lot of work to actually upgrade to get those fixes. Whereas the reason to use Devise or gem like it is that those fixes are automatically in your bundle update, which is super handy. Yeah, that one will be fun. If anybody wants to contribute to that, you can find it on GitHub or on my Twitter account. And I'm sure there will be many things to work on there. One of the things I was kind of trying to decide on was, do we even support multiple models for authentication or is it just one? Because the second you get into that, you've got to metaprogram everything. We can't assume that it's this class. We got to go determine that maybe from the URL or whatever and have the scoping like Devise does. So I don't know if we'll end up doing that, but we'll see. There's a whole lot of part of those like current user is like, that's metaprogram. So if you go through the stack trace, you're going to end up at a string that was defined somewhere dynamically in the source code. So it's like, that is the one thing that complicates it a million times over, which is no fun. So I've been trying to decide, do we even bother with that or just tell you set up roles and things like that in order to differentiate and let everybody log in from one model and one account or whatever. I think that will be a much more maintainable option, but we'll see.
Sounds cool.
Yeah, I was just like inspired one night and was like, after dinner, I'm going to go hack on this for 3 hours. And that was it. It was pretty easy. Everything's turbo ready and tested and whatever, but it's nice to have sort of, here's that stock Rails authentication system that DHH says it's so easy to build. Like, it's pretty easy, but there's still an awful lot to it. And then there's lots of nuances that, like, reset your password token. You could cheat and use signed global IDs with a 15-minute expiration, But in that 15 minutes, that link can be clicked on by anybody. So if that link ever got sent out to a friend or something on accident, they can keep using that link for that time period, which it is what it is. It's probably not a email that you're going to forward, but if you really want to make sure that that token is expired after it's used, you got to toss that stuff in the database and then rotate it when it's used. There are a lot of little nuances to things like that are like, I want to do it right. So I guess we'll put it in the database, which is unfortunate because you want to keep it simple. And you're like, we could drop all these different things. We could drop the rotating of the keys and generating them and the database column and whatever else. But, it is what it is.
True that, homie.
Well,
that's the Midwestern goodbye right there. Well, slaps knee.
Mm-hmm. I love those memes. There's like, ope, when people are like, oops, or whatever. Yep. Yeah. We got our own little language here in the Midwest.
I am happy to now be a part of it. Well, I guess I'm not. Am I really Midwest? I don't know.
I think
I'm
so.
just West.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm Mid-South.
Active West.
No, dude, you're in the South.
I'm on the tip of the Midwest and the tip of the South.
Yeah, but that state specifically is in the South.
No doubt about it. I border Arkansas and Mississippi. I can get to either one within 20 minutes from my house.
Yeah, that's deep South.
All right. See you next week.
Bye.
Okay, bye.